question was, what do we think about a cap and trade? So I guess you said California put one in?
Yeah, they have one going in place in the next few years.
Yeah. If MidAmerican took the lead last year when there was federal legislation, the Waxman-Markey bill out of the House, that was a federal cap and trade. And then it went to the Senate, became a Kerry-Boxer bill, and they modified that a little bit. It was never passed. We think cap and trade is the wrong idea. We are for the cap. We are against the trade for a lot of reasons. The trade results, if you look at that Waxman-Markey bill, a huge wealth transfer out of the Midwest into the coastal states. It really Can
we get a primer on cap and trade first, because I'm not sure
Sure.
everyone will know what you're talking about.
Yeah, good question. On cap, the cap, as the bill, the federal bill that I'm talking about, capped CO2 emissions, wanted it decreased by 17% by the year 2020. The Senate version went to 20% reduction, and then it continued down until it got to 80% reduction of CO2 by some baseline by 2050. So that was part of the cap when they call cap. Now the trade was, the bill set up a complicated trading mechanism that brokers, bankers, international companies, anybody could participate in, but they allocated some free allowances or CO2, the right to emit CO2 to utilities, and put the rest on a trading market. We did not, as we looked at it, MidAmerican customers would have suffered huge economic benefit or detriment. It would have been a $300 million hit the first year in 2012 had that bill gone in, because we were not given enough free allowances. We'd have had to go onto this risky market to try to buy those. In addition, we would have had to reduce our amount of coal or carbon produced by a tremendous amount. To give you an idea of those limits, we could shut off all our coal plants today, run them on natural gas, and we'd only get to 47% reduction. And that bill required us to go 20 to 80% reduction. So that isn't the solution to go to natural gas. The only tool in the toolbox we got is nuclear power right now, because that's along with energy efficiency and renewables. We don't think the cap and trade is workable. We think we're going to propose an alternative legislation. We have a proposal that we've been working on that would just go to the caps and allow utilities incentives to get to those caps, much like policy allowed incentives for wind to be built in Iowa. Probably a long, complicated response. I apologize for that.
Yeah, no, let me say that I totally disagree. Totally disagree. I think a cap and trade system is probably the only way we're going to take on global climate change, and successfully. Europeans are already doing that. They've done the shakeout. They can demonstrate that using the market, and again, I talked about mandates and then markets. You know, you'd like to have a mandate that just hits these guys right in the head real hard until they change their thinking, and then let them go forward because they know how to do it better than government does. Cap and trade is that kind of a system. It probably hurts MidAmerican more than it hurts some other companies, but in general, we're going to be better off, and the cost is going to be not nearly as great as MidAmerican has presented. I mean, we've done this argument before, so I think that maybe we should do it afterwards and we can have a great fight, you know. But cap and trade is one policy that I think we need to have to go forward to actually deal with climate change, because it is the biggest problem that we're ever going to face, I think, as humans.
As far as renewable energy goes, all of you presented on wind power. What other forms, or I guess put simply, why wind power? Why is that more appealing and feasible than other forms of renewable energy, such as solar, et cetera?
The solar we've looked at, and we've looked at some. First of all, to do large scale takes a large amount of land. That's a detriment here in Iowa. Solar is about 10 times the cost of wind, generally. I know they're working on thinner films of solar, and technologies that will help it. But right now, wind is the only economical renewables in large scale that we can use to help offset coal generation and others. So that's why we've done it.
Our feeling is that solar is a future source. It's more a future source in a distributed system where a parking ramp might have a solar array on the top, or an office building or a warehouse might have this solar array on the top. But when you can grow corn for $4 a bushel, or soybeans for $58 a bushel, you really don't want to cover that land up with a solar array. It just doesn't make any economic sense. And ultimately, what drives the technologies we use are the economics. You know, there are policies and there are incentives, and they modify the economics a little bit, but the underlying economics have to be the main driver. And so solar technology has to improve so that the cost per kilowatt hour comes down. The cost per kilowatt hour of coal-fired and natural gas-fired is going to go up over time because of different restrictions that are going to be placed on it. And so there'll be an equilibrium hit where it can work. But in Iowa, you're not going to want to see our farmland that is very productive and can feed the world then covered up with a solar array.
I think we have to reduce, and you reduce in two different ways. I mean, first of all, there's conservation, and then there's efficiency. And the difference is, I have a hybrid car. I get 38 miles to the gallon with a very large car, but I drive it too much. I drive all the way from Mount Vernon down here. I'm a great user of efficiency, but I'm not a very good user of conservation. I ought to have 4 people in my car if I'm going to drive from Mount Vernon, which I don't do. Americans have to start being more conservationists. And starting in 1990, the legislature passed a very strong law that required utility companies to really get into the job of being more efficient and trying to make their customers more conservationists. And in general, we think they've done a pretty good job. And MidAm has a goal of decreasing the amount of electricity by 1.5% per year, making customers just get more efficient and more conservationist. And I think we can do it, and we have to do it because we're profligate in our use of energy in this country. Twice as much as the Swedes use. I mean, they're not primitive.
So, I mean, everyone had a version of the graph that showed the sort of dramatic increase in wind, but if we trend consumption, then you're not displacing fossil fuels necessarily with that, you're just meeting. And so are there targets on the consumption side?
Our colleagues, the question was, are there targets on the consumption side? Our colleagues at the Office of Energy Independence would share a energy efficiency target of 20% by 2030, just from efficiency. I have a personal challenge for the University of Iowa, and I'll share it at Iowa State also, but I'm an Iowa Stater. But the opportunity is maybe greater at the University of Iowa because of the tragedy of the flood. The challenge would be to install geothermal as a heat and cooling source as you rebuild your facilities. In the Des Moines Public Schools, they have installed geothermal on every building that they renovate and on their new buildings. On a moderately sized elementary school, they save $200,000 a year in heating and cooling costs. Basically, it was never cooled before. So they're saving $200,000 in heating costs, plus enough money to air condition the building. They've done that with 20 elementary buildings and 3 high schools and 5 middle schools. It is a huge amount of money saved. And I don't think the University of Iowa has put in its first geothermal unit for a building.
It does open up, another range of policy, because you have energy policy basically embedded in building codes, in emission standards, in the sort of energy efficiency fees for public institutions like the.
The answer is yes. First of all, the performance of the nuclear units, and we own 25% of the Quad Cities nuclear station, which is just on the other side of the river in the Quad Cities area. It's operated by ComEd. They've improved their operations, efficiency, and safety tremendously over a period of time. Those units have gone in and gotten license extensions. The original license extension, or original license, was like 30 years. They've gone on and got 20 more years or 10 years, whatever they could prove to the NRC. As you look at it, the president of MidAmerican used to run a nuclear facility over in Nebraska. He tells me that they're looking at compartmentalized, and I'm not saying that right, nuclear, where you'd go in with just compartments of smaller nuclear plants so that you can match growth as you go. That has a promise. There's also standard design that has a promise. But you'll see nuclear, especially if carbon legislation goes, it doesn't make any difference what nuclear costs. It's the only tool in our toolbox we got to replace coal at the present time on baseload facilities. So you'll see a lot of advancements, a lot of work is going on, and there's 7 or 8 plants being thought about in the United States right now. So the technology is definitely advancing, and it's pretty high cost. But again, if they put a price on carbon, it don't make a difference what the price of nuclear is. It's going to be in play.
Actually, it's real high cost, and I totally agree. I mean, you're now running power plants, nuclear power plants, at a capacity factor of 95%, maybe higher. In the 1970s, they were running at about 65%. There's been a dramatic change. Also, they're running them hotter. Duane Arnold used to be a 515 megawatt plant. It's now around 600. But when you build new power plants, and it doesn't just mean in the United States, you can run into so many problems. Some companies build nukes rather cheaply, nuke power, for instance. Some people just make a total mess of it. And there have been more bankruptcies in utility in the industry because of nuclear power than anything else. And even the French can't seem to build them as well as their reputation. There's a plant being built in Finland by the French, which is 3 years behind schedule and double the cost. That's when you start out deciding to take on a nuclear power plant, you have no idea what it's finally going to cost. And that's the reason Obama, only last Tuesday, came out saying that us, the American taxpayers, are on the hook for the cost overruns that may happen when the Southern Company goes forward with the first nuclear power plant started in the United States in 30 years. The last one we brought online was back in 1996, and that was 6 times over budget. So that's what you get into when you get into nuclear power. It may be the right answer, and you got to get away from coal. And nuclear power has some great advantages there, but oh my golly, it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, I think also as we talk about energy and energy emergencies and energy crises, even in the state of Iowa, this session, Senate File 2100, did look at the possibility of thinking about, talking about, starting to explore a location for a nuclear power plant in the state of Iowa to the tune of, I think, $500 million, $500 million. But if you've got some extra time on a Saturday night, Senate File 2100, I'm not sure, did it make it through the file?
Yeah, but I do have an update for you. You want an update? Okay. Yeah, 2100 was offered up by a representative from the Cedar Rapids area. We today have offered an amendment on that, and it's now changed numbers. It's actually House File 2399. And what that bill now does is allow MidAmerican, it directs MidAmerican to look at nuclear potential in Iowa. Our point is we don't know whether we can count on nuclear being a part. Is it acceptable Iowa energy policy? How many nuclear sites are there in the state of Iowa? How many megawatts are there? We don't know as we look over the 20 years to replace all our coal plants, how much can we count on nuclear power? So what this bill will allow us to do is collect $15 million from our customers over the next 3 years to explore nuclear potential in Iowa. It doesn't commit us to build, it just says what's the potential and whether we can start counting on that. Because if we can't start on that, like I said, we've got to really start thinking about how we're going to replace our coal.
I mean, it's a very interesting policy problem, because if you think back to, the graph we showed about all the different sources of energy, what was sort of buried in that was also the import-export question. And, if you think about public policy generating public benefits or public goods, I mean, we talk about energy, job number one for a lot of people is to wean us off foreign oil. That doesn't necessarily mean us weaning off fossil fuels. So that can lead to, drilling in the Alaska Wildlife Refuge. It can lead to more exploration of local coal and local fossil fuels. But another, and so the environmental benefits are another kind of public good. And then when you talk about the environmental benefits, then, I think there's really a diversity of opinion on nuclear as to whether it's clean. It's certainly cleaner in terms of emissions than coal, but people, because of its history, are still scared of the sort of long-term prospects, the waste problem. And so I think what you find a lot of people talking about is nuclear as a sort of transition that will get us off the high-emission fossil fuel sources and act as a sort of, middle ground that we can then move to more fully renewable sources.
I would suggest that part of the process in analyzing nuclear is to help the public make an analysis. Because if we don't, as a public, learn the baseline issues and keep thinking this is the era of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, when those things are really items of the past and not likely to happen again, but we still, as a public, think that way, we're going to inhibit our reactions in the same way that in Martha's Vineyard, wind is not a acceptable renewable source. An offshore wind turbine that is this big in the horizon is something that can't happen, and that could be the same with nuclear, and it might be the only thing that we have to get us off of coal. We need to understand it better and understand, I would say in France the public opinion would be very much different than the public opinion in Iowa, and they have a very much higher percentage of nuclear power and very little wind.
Teresa, you're not going to argue for a little reactor in every elementary school?
Kids at Glow.
Yeah. Yeah.
The not in my backyard? Yeah, the question was, is not my backyard or the NIMBY as referenced, that making a difference? Some people just don't want anything close to where they live to obstruct their view. Is that the major barrier? That's one of the barriers, although I will have to say with all the wind that we've built, and we've got over 800 towers up in the air, we have very few landowner issues. We try to microsite those things on landowners' land that they prefer to have as a site, so long as it doesn't sacrifice the energy output. We move those around. We've had very few issues of that. In fact, we've had farmers be disappointed that we haven't put one in their land. That's a cash crop that produces every year, no matter what corn beans does or what the weather does, they get paid. So we've had a lot of interest in farmers that, because they know when MidAmerican offers them an option to do it, we're going to build it. And they're pretty excited for us to be there. So we haven't seen that so much as far as wind. But nuclear, I'm sure that will be an issue, as well as we talk about transmission that's going to be built. I'm of the believer there's very few transmission corridors in the state of Iowa left. And so when we build these next new ones, we better put them in the right place, because I think it's going to be very hard to get it sited because of the NIMBY issue.
Yeah, I think I demonstrated in my presentation too how much community pride there is for these wind turbines, especially when they're at their school or at their local business. Again, I think it's people asking for them rather than not.
You know, it's odd that, I'm in agreement, there's very little of the NIMBY on wind in the state of Iowa, or in Minnesota either. Wisconsin, there is. Wisconsin, they've had a heck of a time citing any wind turbines at all. And I'm not sure what it is, but you know, you get started on the wrong foot or something. Or Iowa, I maintain, got started on the right foot with the first RPS, the first Renewable Portfolio Standard, and then started moving, and then people at the IDED used that to bring in lots of manufacturers, and the start really mattered a lot. And for some reason, in Wisconsin, they started the other way. And even though it seems like Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin are as alike as any three states can be, a new law just passed last year in Wisconsin is the first time they're going to actually get very much wind brought online. And again, the other argument about Martha's Vineyard offshore in the East Coast, great place to put a lot of wind turbines, but a lot of opposition too. And why it happened in Massachusetts, it didn't happen in New Jersey, which is going forward with quite a bunch of new wind. Policy is, you can sit here and analyze and do a very good job of trying to figure out where policy is going. But then there are all these funny things like, these Wisconsinites just don't like wind. I'm not sure why.
They have cheese on their heads. I will give you one example of how Nimbyism shapes policy, and it isn't as much a overt thing maybe as others. I have a friend that is a developer and does the permitting for wind farms, and I called at Christmas time to wish her a Merry Christmas and how are things going. She says, oh, I wish the only developments that I had to permit were in Iowa. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, I had two wind farms that we started permitting in April of this year. And Iowa is all done. It's in a manila folder on my desk, and it's about an inch thick. And I've got an East Coast state that I'm now on my 4th expandable folder, and we're nowhere close. It'll be at least another year. And to a large extent, that extra regulation and that extra permitting is coming out of NIMBYism and avoiding going overboard to prove up to the NIMBY faction.